Okay, students, to start off Unit 2 and introduce decimal place value, we're going to be drawing some pictures on these decimal squares. I'd like you to shade in what I shade in. It doesn't have to be an art project, but I'd like you to try to match what I'm shading in quickly and also do the labeling underneath each square that we go through. So to start off, we're going to begin with the top row of decimal squares. You'll notice that these are cut into columns. The bottom ones are cut into small squares, and on the back side we have tiny little rectangles that our decimal squares are cut into. So first we're going to begin with the decimal squares that show rows or columns, and we're going to begin by shading in the top left. We're going to shade in one of those columns, and then in the second one we're going to fully shade in a square, and we're going to shade in 5 columns with that second square. So once you do the shading, we're going to take a look at what these are called. Now, because this column represents 1 out of 10 pieces, if this is an entire whole square, one whole, and this column is 1 out of 10 pieces, we call that 1/10. And 1/10 has a TH on the end because it's not a 10, it's a tenth. It's a piece of one whole. And we write that with one decimal place. 0.1 would be a way of saying 1/10. On the next square that we shaded in fully, we're basically showing that this represents one whole. And if this represents one whole, and we have 5 rows over here, we have 5/10 shaded in on the second square. Put the two together, if we look at these two decimal squares as one whole unit, we have 1 and 5/10. Make sure the TH is on the end, 1 and 5/10. And in the middle of the two, let's write it what it would look like in standard form, which is with a number, and that's with the digits 1.5. That would be 1 and 5/10. So we're modeling what decimals look like. If this is one whole, then a column simply represents 1/10 because it takes 10 pieces to make a whole. In the next row, I'd like to shade in 2 full boxes, and we're going to put an equal sign between the two. And in this row, we're basically going to show that 10/10 is being shaded in right now. This is 10/10, all 10 rows or columns, and that of course represents one whole or 1.0. So having 10/10 is the same as having one whole. Let's move to the third row of decimal squares, and we're going to shade in 5 columns in each of the first 2 boxes. Shade in 5 of the columns. We've already said that that would be 0.5. 0.5 because one column was 0.1. 0.5 of course is 5/10. We're going to put the TH on there. 0.5, 5/10 equals, we're going to fill in an equal sign, and that 5/10 could be written as a fraction. 5/10 and 5/10 sound the same way, and we know that 5/10 is also the same as the fraction 1/2. So in this piece right here, we're showing that it's 5/10 as a fraction, 1/2 as a fraction, but also 0.5, which is the same as 5/10. Okay, that's it with the 10th decimal squares. We're going to drop down to row 4, where things are cut a little smaller, and in that next row, we're going to shade in one of the tiny little squares in the entire whole, just one tiny little square. And if you were to count those, you'll notice that it takes 100 of them to fill an entire whole. So this is an example of what 1/100th, make sure you put your TH on the end, represents. We write 1/100th with 2 decimal places, 0.01. Remember, 0.1 up top here was just 1/10. 2 places over is 1/100th. So we have 1/100th represented by that little piece. On the next row, we're going to shade in 1 full column of those 10 little boxes, and over here we're going to put an equal sign, and then we're going to shade in the same amount but going horizontally to try to prove a point with this. So if we shade in one row of 10 little squares, we have 0.1. We've already said that up top here, that this 0.1 is 1/10. This is the same amount of shading, just cut a little bit differently. So we can still say we have 1/10. And if we look at it in a different direction, this is the same amount of shading, it's just written in a different direction. That 1/10 is the same as having 10/100ths, or 0.10. 10/100ths, 10 little squares, is the same as what one column would be. 1/10 is the same as 10/100ths. Moving on to the second to last row, we're going to shade in half of each of the 100th squares that we have down here, or 5 columns, like we did up top here. So we're going to shade in 5 and 5. And maybe you think you understand what we're going to look at here, but we have 5/10 because 5 rows, 5 columns are shaded in just like this one up here. This was also 5/10. But we're going to prove that naming it differently can show us the same value even though it has a different name. So if we shade in 5 columns, this is also 50 little squares. So 5/10, 5 columns, is the same as having 50 hundredths, THS on the end, and notice how the number changes. Instead of 0.5, which was 5/10, now we have 0.50, which is 50 hundredths, and both of those decimals are worth the same amount. And finally, in the last row on the front side of your paper, we're going to fill in a fully shaded square, another fully shaded square, and then 2 columns in the last square. So 2 fully shaded ones and 2 columns in the last one. And we put these together, we have these 2 holes right here. Notice how 2 and the word and follows the whole numbers, and because we have 2 extra columns, we call that 2/10. So we're looking at 2 and 2/10 by combining these 3 pictures together. Notice how 2 and 2/10 is written. We have 2 in the whole number place. We have 2 in the tenths place to stand for these 2 columns that we shaded. Okay, almost finished. Now we're going to flip over and look at the enlarged decimal squares. And they're enlarged so that we can see these tiny little rectangles. So we're going to shade in on the back one of these tiny little rectangles. And if you were to count how many tiny little rectangles fill an entire decimal square, this entire piece, you'd be counting for a while, but you may realize that it would take 1,000 of them to fill this entire square, or one hole. So we're going to call this 1,000th with a TH on the end, not 1,000, but 1,000th. And notice how we shift over one more decimal place. Now it's 0.001. 3 places to the right is your thousandths place. So this is representing 1,000th. Moving on in that same square, we're going to shade in one small little square, which includes a bunch of the little rectangles down here, and maybe you can tell what we're going to say here. But remember, this one little square was the same as this square that's over on the other side. So we have a couple ways of looking at this. First of all, we know that this was 100th. Fill this in beside it, but this was 100th because it was one little square out of 100. And now if we look at the tiny rectangles, we may see that it takes 10 of those to make that 100th. So we could also name the same amount of shading as 10 thousandths. 0.010, 10 thousandths, because it's 10 little rectangles. These 2 decimals are worth the same amount, and maybe you're starting to see a pattern here where adding a 0 to the end of the decimal doesn't necessarily change its value, just changes the way you say it. So 100th is the same as 10 thousandths. And we're going to go to the last decimal square, and we're going to shade in what would be 5 of those little squares. 5 of these little squares over here, just enlarged on this side. 5 little squares. Not a full column, but basically a half of what a column would be. And you may see that that's 5 hundredths, because it's 5 of the little squares, not the tiniest rectangles. And that's written as 0.05, 5 hundredths, THS. Or we can think about how many tiny rectangles are shaded in this same piece. And if we were to count them, we would know that there's 50 little rectangles in that same amount of shading. So besides having 5 hundredths, we're also showing that this would be 50 thousandths, or 0.050, 50 thousandths. So 50 thousandths is the same as 5 hundredths, and again, it's just as simple as one extra 0 added to the end, changes the name, but doesn't change the amount of shading. Make sure you've taken a minute and had a chance to copy in everything we've written so far. Now to wrap up this video, pause if you need to, but take a minute and make sure everything in blue has been shaded in correctly on both sides of the paper, and also make sure you've labeled everything that you see right now in green. We've got numbers, which we call standard form, and we've got words, which we call word form. Make sure you filled in all the green, and pause the video and catch up if you need to.